Hello and welcome. We're going to be talking about technology-based industries and the management of innovation in this lecture. A few things that we'll be talking about: how to obtain how do you obtain a competitive advantage in a technology-intensive industry, strategies for exploiting innovation, standards, platforms, and network externalities, platform-based markets, and implementing tech strategies. The first thing to realize is that, well, how does innovation actually happen, and when does it become valuable? We start off with a core of basic knowledge. Think about like knowledge in physics, innovations in physics, innovations in chemistry. A lot of this basic knowledge is probably happening in research universities where physicists, chemists, engineers are actually just discovering new scientific knowledge, mathematicians, etc. In the next stage, somebody invents something based on this knowledge. Crucially, for our purposes, it doesn't become an innovation until there's commercial viability, until it creates value. The way I like to say this is an invention doesn't become an innovation until willingness to pay exceeds the cost to make it. And then once we have an innovation, there's demand for it. Customers are willing to pay. We're willing to provide it because the willingness to pay exceeds the cost, and it gets diffused both on the demand side. It says adoption there, people buy it, and on the supply side, where our competitors, you start to get competition with people competing and trying to imitate whoever came up with the innovation in the first place. Here we have some examples of that cycle. Xerography, right? That's photocopying or copying. Jet engines, right? 17th century Newtonian physics. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. That's the knowledge behind a jet engine. First patent doesn't come until 1930. First product comes out in 1957. I think it was the de Havilland Comet, but I could be wrong. And then that was imitated very quickly in 1959. MP3 players, similar thing. Instant messaging, basic knowledge was there in the 80s. First patent 2002, product launch 2008. I think who they're thinking of here is BlackBerry with BlackBerry Messenger. And then it's copied, you can't see here, in 2009 by Apple with iMessage. It's not enough just to come up with a great innovation, though, or at least that's only part of the picture. The other part of the picture is who gets the profits from it, who appropriates the value, rather. Profits are what we get as a company, but sometimes the value is what we're talking about here. Does the customer get the value, the suppliers who make your parts, the innovator, or the competition, right? The other imitators and other followers are the competition. If you look at different industries, this value is dispersed very differently. In smartphones, the customers capture most of the value. Wherever you see the customers capturing lots of value, that means there's competition, right? It's competition that drives the prices down and allows customers to capture value. The innovator captures very little here. The followers captured quite a bit in smartphones. Suppliers capture some. Complementers, if we're thinking about smartphones, that would be people making apps, accessories. They make a fair bit as well. If we think about personal computers, again, the customer is capturing the lion's share, the innovator very little, followers very little. Suppliers here are capturing a lot. Well, why is that? Well, if you think about personal computers, what are the key components that cost the most money in a laptop? It's going to be the CPU that's going to be made by Intel or AMD, and it's going to be the operating system, which is either Windows or iOS. By the way, these would look very different for Apple. Apple doesn't let other parties capture their value. With smartphones, Apple captures a huge amount of the complementers capture far less because Apple takes a 30% cut through the App Store. They make their own chips, so suppliers capture less, and they tie you to an iOS with the hardware. So they do very well there. Pharmaceuticals, the innovator captures the lion's share here. Why is that? Well, because of patents. Pharmaceuticals are easier to protect and get enforceable patents for So they capture a lot more. Followers here would be generic drug manufacturers that only really get in on the game once the patent's expired. Suppliers don't capture that much in this case because most drugs are made from basic chemicals that are commodities. And the customers capture less value, especially at the early stage, because the innovator has a monopoly through the patent. This would look very different if we looked at the very first section during the life of the patent versus after the patent expires, when customers and followers capture a lot more value and the innovator stops really capturing much at all. What determines the profits to a firm from innovation? Well, first of all, there's the value. The price can't be higher than the willingness to pay. So the higher the willingness to pay, the more potential value there is. But then finally, the ability to appropriate that value. Legal protection like patents, copyrights, trademarks, complementary resources. If in the video game industry right now, it's the providers of complementary resources, the game studios, that capture a ton of value. That's why Microsoft is buying up game studios. They're seeing which way things are going. That's going to become increasingly true as we move from console-based gaming to cloud-based gaming. The imitability of the technology. If it's easy to copy, followers are going to be able to capture more of the value, and the lead time. How long will it take followers to figure out what we're doing and catch up with us? Intel's appropriation regime in their chips really depended solely on their lead time, right? That's why they released a new chip every year. If they could stay 1 year ahead of AMD, they always had this advantage and can always appropriate most of the profits. They've lost that lead time now, largely through bungled attempts to backwards integrate into manufacturing, which took their eye off R&D. And now AMD has caught up to them, even though it was the x86 architecture is their innovation, and AMD actually pays a license to use that x86 architecture. Different types of legal protection: patents, copyrights, trade secrets. Patents and copyrights are legal protection. Trade secrets, are very explicit types of legal protection. Trade secrets are less formal type of protection and maybe harder to defend, but still valuable. Employee contracts, non-disclosure agreements, things like that can also keep technology from getting out to imitators, but it's a bit, employee contracts are a very leaky type of protection. If we look at complementary resources, these are all different types of complementary resources that might be required. It's not a very good visual, unfortunately. The textbook is good, the slides aren't great here. Manufacturing and distribution are both potential types of complementary resources. Finance, if you go to Ashley Furniture, well, that's not really an innovative product. But sometimes the provider of finance, if it's a very expensive product, the provider of finance might capture quite a bit. Maybe you have marketing partners, complementary technologies. If you are making DVDs, you probably aren't the same company that's also making the DVD players, although you might be, but there'll be different firms in both of those. These are from a survey of managers and their perceptions of what are the most effective means of protecting innovation. If you look here, varies widely between firms depending on the industry. Patents, though, are generally surprisingly ineffective for a lot of industries except drugs. And even there, only 50% of them say they're effective. Or they're only deemed to be 50% effective. Lead time has a similar effectiveness. Secrecy, about the same, maybe even slightly more so than patents, in fact more so than patents even for drug companies. Manufacturing, so being able to control the quality and having your innovation in manufacturing is deemed to be actually fairly effective. Think about Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. A lot of their lead over their innovation is just that it's complex and it's embodied in all sorts of different manufacturing processes that are very hard to disentangle. The US is trying to bring chip manufacturing over here, and it's really not moving very fast. Taiwan spent the last 50 years building, and TSMC spent the last 50 years building their manufacturing processes and capacity, and you can't, it's so complex, you can't just get the blueprints and build a new factory in Arizona, it turns out. Different reasons for why firms patent. Number one reason, unsurprisingly, is to prevent copying, to block others. So in that case, they're not actually trying necessarily to profit from the innovation, but they just don't want others to get there first. For use in negotiations, to enhance reputation. Licensing revenue is fairly small. To measure performance, who knew? But I suppose if you were a high-intensity research firm, you'd use patents as a measure of performance. Different strategies for exploiting or getting profits from innovation. One, license it out. You come up with the idea, let someone else make it and sell it. This is very common in drug industries, as well as in tech industries too sometimes. Outsourcing. Again, if you're licensing, you're just letting somebody do it completely. If you're outsourcing, you have more of the value chain, but certain functions are outsourced. Strategic alliance, maybe you're very good at R&D, but you let someone else do the manufacturing. These are really all just moving from, and sorry, it's mirrored here, but on the left side from very low integration. These are really vertical integration or internalization degrees, from licensing, which is really not integrated at all, to internal commercialization, which is fully integrated. Different risk profiles and different resources needed depending on which strategy you choose. I won't go through all of them, but they're worth looking at. Licensing is fairly low risk in terms of risk of overproduction or having to investing a lot and then losing that money. You're letting someone else carry the risk, but possibly they capture the profits as well, as you see on the far right there. Biggest risks, but potentially biggest upside as well, because you're capturing everything. But to capture that, you have to also make the highest investment. Think about that. Is vertical integration profitable article? Some interesting findings about who captures or who wins with new innovations. It's not always the innovator. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And it kind of tells you on the right there who won, the leader or the follower. Social networking. Facebook was not the first company in this game at all. If you're as old as I am, you remember every week there was a new social media site that your friends wanted you to join, and eventually Facebook got enough critical mass that they really won that battle. Microprocessors, the innovator was Intel. They were still the leader at the time this was written, but arguably AMD is catching them up very quickly. MP3 players, Diamond Multimedia. I had a friend with the first MP3 player. It was made by Diamond Multimedia. It was called the Rio, I think. I could be wrong, but iPod was really the one that won and really made this quite successful, and Diamond sort of went out of business there. Video games, Atari came out with the first, but Nintendo and Sony captured that. You could add Microsoft to this later on. So all sorts of interesting examples there. So which leads us to the question, should we be the leader or the follower? Well, a few key considerations here. Can we protect it with intellectual property rights or a good lead time? If yes, there's an advantage in leadership. How important are complementary resources? If complementary resources need to be built and established, there's a real risk that you're going to have to create them all as the leader, and other firms that follow you get to benefit, what we call externalities. If you're the first company to come up with an electric vehicle and you have to invest in a huge charging network, well, followers can benefit from that charging network that you've had to invest to create. So sometimes it's better to be a follower. Is there a potential to establish an industry standard which will create network effects? If yes, definitely an advantage in leadership. Trying to think of examples here. Think about things like video games are a great example. If you can be the one that establishes what a quality product looks like that everybody else has to copy, and you can somehow protect that, there's going to be an advantage in leadership. Other examples of industry standards, the PDF format by Adobe. They established really the first easiest way to electronically exchange documents, and I mean, decades later, PDF is still the standard way to do that. And Adobe, even though Adobe used to be the main creator of desktop publishing software, they were sort of moved aside by Microsoft with Microsoft Word. Adobe had a product called PageMaker that nobody uses anymore, but that PDF standard endures, and they get licensing revenue from that and have been very successful because they still have licensing revenue. Different ways of managing uncertainty. First of all, we think about the types of uncertainty. Is it technological uncertainty, where we just don't know what might be invented or what the dominant design will be? That's very difficult. And you don't want to commit to large production runs until the dominant design has emerged. With market uncertainty, that's basically getting at trying to figure out what's going to fly with the customers. What are they going to like? What's going to create demand? What won't? Certain products that might seem like a slam dunk in the R&D lab and the marketing team don't take off, whereas others do. The iPad is a great example of a product that nobody really knew there would be such a demand for iPods. People had their smartphones, people had laptops that were very small. It didn't seem like there was a space for something in between those two, but Apple figured it out and demand was immense. Strategies for managing these risks. Cooperate with lead users. So your early adopters, do market research on them, be in constant contact with them. I like to do music producing, so I'm an early adopter. I always get in on the beta releases for new music producing software, and it's buggy and it's not a very good experience. It's not ready to release to the public yet, but as an early adopter, I get access to it in exchange. I give them feedback on features I like, features I don't, things that are working, bugs that come up. Flexibility, keep your options open. Don't commit to too much capital early on until you realize what demand will be, and that's more clear. Limit risk exposure, same idea here. Avoid overcommitting on capital. Outsource if you can. Outsourcing puts the risk on someone else. Use alliances with other firms. And keep debt low. You don't want to create large capital commitments creates or fixed asset commitments creates what's called operating leverage, where your fixed costs are too high relative to your variable costs. Debt creates financial leverage, where you have large interest expenses. Let's talk a bit now about standards and network effects. For a lot of products, especially new innovations, there's eventually a dominant design emerges. There's lots of different competing products early on. It's mostly early adopters who are buying at this stage because the product is expensive and risky to invest in. But eventually, customers express what they like most through their purchases, and the firms on the supply side tend to all group around and start to make whatever the dominant design is. In cars, Henry Ford's Model T is an obvious example. The IBM 360 in mainframes, that's a pretty old example, but that is how IBM first made their first $1 million, so to speak, was through these mainframe computers in the early ages of computing. The Douglas DC-3 would have been a precursor to the Boeing 737, but Douglas was the company that came up with what was eventually the dominant design. Technical standards emerge where there are what's called network, that should say externalities, not extremities. Bad slides. An externality is where the cost of something is imposed on someone else. I benefit from someone else, and someone else pays, basically. In the case of pollution, firms profit by polluting, by externalizing the cost onto the environment and all the other people who have to put up with the pollution. If I can get away without treating my pollution properly, I can externalize those costs of polluting on everyone else and make the profit from those reduced costs. In the case of network externalities with innovation, the idea here is that the more people that adopt it, the more valuable it becomes. Think of a telephone. If I'm the only person that owns, if I own the only telephone in the world, that's not a very valuable thing for me to have. If two people, me and my mom have a telephone, or me and my family, now it's a bit more valuable. I can call someone. If the pizza place gets a telephone, now it's even more valuable. If the whole world is on it, it becomes very valuable. And as more people buy a telephone, my telephone that I bought as the first ever person becomes more valuable without me having to do anything. I bought that first phone for whatever the price was. As more people come on the network, it has more value for me. You get this with things like video game consoles, especially before the sort of cross-platform where it didn't matter what console you were on. If you bought a Sony PlayStation and wanted to play online games with your friends, you could only play with other PlayStation users. So you tended to want to buy a console that you thought would have lots of other users. If you were the only person with that console, there was no one to play with. Entrenchment of dominant designs. Once a dominant design emerges and gets baked into the product, it can create switching costs if you try and introduce a new one. For example, USB-C is the dominant design now for computers. That change has created switching costs for all of us if you've been computing for a long time. All those USB-A products that you had that don't fit anymore, or other types of connectors. Maybe the switching cost was just 90 cents for a new connector, but that's an example where when you switch, you create, when you have a dominant design, it creates switching costs. If you were somebody who had an Apple product that would only take those funny little Apple video connectors, there were switching costs involved with moving to something else. If you move from Android to Apple, you'll have to rebuy a lot of your apps. Maybe your smartwatch, you need to get rid of that and buy a new one. That creates switching costs from the technical standard that you've adopted. It mentioned there at the end that if you do decide to change a technical standard, you need partners on board. So if you're going to switch from USB-A to USB-C or Lightning, you really want as many other companies to adopt that with you. Otherwise, if you're the only company adopting a new standard, customers aren't going to want to switch. Sources of network externalities. If there's an actual network, and then the value increases the more people are on the network. Think about Facebook, telephones, anything that connects users. Online auction sites, same thing. The more users you have on eBay, the more valuable eBay is to everyone on the network. Availability of complementary products, that also creates network externalities. One of the reasons it would be very hard to create a new phone operating system is because developers don't want to develop for lots and lots of different operating systems. If you are one of those people who, for example, uses Linux or Linux instead of Windows or Mac OS, you just have the amount of software available to you is very limited because developers don't want to develop for something that's not going to sell, and if there aren't enough users, they're not going to sell enough hardware, enough software. Even with repairs, I once looked at getting a Ducati motorcycle, but there are far fewer places that are able to do repairs on Ducati motorcycles, so it's very expensive to maintain a Ducati motorcycle. So I just went with a Suzuki that has a lot broader of a network for servicing. It's a lot easier to get your Ford Focus serviced than a Lamborghini because not as many people own Lamborghinis. These are all network effects. Here's a bunch of examples of companies that own a network standard. So PC processors, Intel owns the x86 standard. So even when AMD makes chips, they have to pay a licensing fee to Intel. Compact discs, not super relevant anymore. Oracle owns the Java language standard that's used for a lot of web apps, not as much anymore. Now it would be something called JavaScript, which funnily enough is completely unrelated to Java. Qualcomm owns the standard, the CDMA standard for modems. I'm not sure how much these are used. Adobe Flash, that was proprietary. Steve Jobs didn't like having to pay licensing fees to Adobe, so he actually just got rid of Adobe Flash from iPads and told Adobe or the users too bad. Um, uh, yeah, a lot of these are pretty old examples. What would be some newer examples? I think the MP3 format might be proprietary, but I'm not sure. Apple Lossless is a standard that's used and obviously owned by Apple. Microsoft's probably one of the most obvious examples with Windows. See if you can come up with any of your own. Um, Two different strategies when you're competing for standards. Maximize value appropriation or maximize market acceptance. There's a couple interesting examples here. Video cassettes. You guys probably don't remember these unless you have older siblings or happen to have a few kicking around. VHS was very much the dominant technology for video cassettes and was more widely distributed. Betamax, though, was known to be better quality, and so what you might call video files, people who were really into higher definition video, went Betamax. That was owned by Sony, I believe. The standard for VHS, I think, was JVC. Sony decided just to make a better product that would be less widely adopted, but would be more profitable. An example you guys are probably more familiar with is PCs versus Mac. IBM created the PC and got great market acceptance through what's called the Wintel standard, Windows with an Intel chip. But unfortunately, they were sort of the victim of their own success. There was tons of copying, tons of imitators because it was a more open platform. They didn't tie, Windows wasn't tied to IBM computers, neither was Intel. They were outsourced third parties. And so now there's tons and tons of PC companies. IBM is not one of them anymore. The market fundamentals, they decided it wasn't profitable enough and moved to services. Apple Mac, on the other hand, ties their software and now their chips to their own brand. You can't have an M3 or M4 Apple Silicon chip, which is the best chip right now. You can't have iOS unless you buy from Apple. So they've chosen to have a smaller market share, although it's still very large, and instead to maximize profit or value appropriation. Things to consider when fighting a standards war. First, you need to determine whether there's a potential for the standard to emerge. If it relies on complementary products, for example, you're going to get a standard. Think about HD DVD versus Blu-ray. Studios were going to have to choose one or the other, and that was going to determine the amount of content available for your users, the network externalities. So in that case, there definitely was a potential for a standard to emerge. Assemble allies. Complementers, customers, competitors to build a bandwagon. You really need to get that critical mass. In the case of Blu-ray versus HD, Blu-ray got Warner Bros. Or Warner Studios to commit exclusively to Blu-ray, and that ended the war. As soon as that happened, I think it was Toshiba, I can't remember which was which. Sony was Blu-ray, I think Toshiba was HD DVD. Toshiba just said, we're out. You guys got Warner Bros., game over, we'll exit. Preempt the market, build a user base quickly, enter early, attract key customers, and adopt penetration pricing. Game consoles, with the exception of Nintendo, because they use what's called a blue ocean strategy, but game consoles are always released at a loss. The customers pay less than it costs to make the consoles. This is because Sony and Microsoft are preempting the market, trying to get the user base and market share as quickly as possible so that they can build those network effects, get a critical mass of users, which attracts game developers and more users. Kind of the rich get richer. Sometimes it's also called the Matthew effect from the Bible. To him who has, more will be given. To him who has not, even what he has will be taken away. That gets at this idea of network effect as well. Manage expectations. Use launch and pre-launch publicity to convince the market you will be the winner. When Sony entered the video game market with the PlayStation 1, they spent a ton of money on advertising because they needed to convince users and video game studios they could get a large enough user base to make the product viable. If you think about failed consoles, that's where they failed. They didn't get enough users early on, maybe didn't spend enough on advertising, didn't create enough hype. Lots of examples here. How can the winner sustain the standard? Don't fall behind on technology, ensure backwards compatibility. A lot of video game consoles would always make sure that previous generation games can be played to reduce the switch. You don't want high switching costs if you're trying to get market share. So you really want to reduce those and keep as much market share as you had. So if you're releasing a PlayStation 4, make sure that people can still play their PlayStation 3 games on it so you don't create switching costs and people are willing to adopt it. Meet threat of disruptive technology by offering customers a migration path. What would be an example of that? I mean, essentially making sure that all your accessories, anything you've invested in, can come forward. So that kind of is the same as backwards compatibility. If you're introducing new software, you really need to make sure that so when Windows does an update, you need to make sure that customers can still move all their software that they have to the new Windows format. When Windows, or if you think about Apple going to Apple Silicon, the programs that were written on the x86 architecture for when Apple was using Intel chips, they wanted to release M4s, they had to create I think it was called Rosetta, that basically was a piece of software that would translate all your old x86 software so that you could still use it on Apple Silicon. So they offered customers a migration path in that way. What if you're a loser? Ensure compatibility or go for niche. So basically, if you're a loser, just make sure that your product works with whatever the dominant design turns out to be or the standard turns out to be. I guess if you think about, let's say, smartwatches, Google OS watches, those will still work. That dominant design lost, I think you could say, to the Apple Watch. Maybe it didn't, but just make sure they're compatible, right? Make sure that your Google OS watch will still work with a Mac computer or an iPhone and vice versa, or go for niche. Just try to create enough value that you'll get a small base of users that will use your thing, even though you haven't captured the market. Examples of this. Laserdisc might be an example, or Betamax. That's an example as well. There was a thing called Laserdisc, which really didn't have high adoption rate. It was kind of the size of a vinyl record, and it was a way to watch movies before DVDs came out. It didn't take off, but you did get a niche of video files, again, same as Betamax. We still captured value. I'm not going to go through this slide, but it basically talks about different structures needed for an innovating organization versus an operating organization. You might think of this similar to the last lecture on industry evolution. You need a different structure, processes, rewards, and even different types of staff or people for a creative business or maybe an early life cycle industry than you do for an operating organization or a mature life cycle industry. In a mature stage or in an operating organization, you're trying to reduce costs, you're trying to improve quality. Reward is based usually on financial metrics, and you recruit people who are specialists and you get a division of labor. People who, very good accountants, very good lawyers, people who just do one thing and do it very well at low cost. You're looking for economies of scale with your people, basically. In the innovative organization, it's less bureaucratic. You need to be able to make decisions much more quickly. You're not trying to make everything conform as you are with an operating organization to a quality standard. You're trying to get lots of different ideas, blue sky thinking. The creatives are a different sort of type than your accountants. No offense to accountants here. So you have different types of people. You'd have different types of people who work in new products at Apple than you would have who work in the cost accounting department at Ford, for example. And you manage them differently, different types of compensation. Equity compensation is really common in innovative industries. Mark Zuckerberg's been trying to poach staff from OpenAI with $100 million pay packages, but a lot of these OpenAI engineers probably have equity stakes in the company, and they don't want to leave because they want to hold on to those options or shares because the value of those is increasing so quickly. So you tie the performance of the firm to the financial reward of your staff to the performance of the firm and the ideas they're working on to motivate them that way. Different organizational initiatives to stimulate innovation, cross-functional teams, very important. Get people out of their silos, get specialists into the same room working together. This was mentioned in the core competence article. Have product champions, make someone responsible for the new product or the new innovation that can really drive it, probably someone charismatic that's a good leader. You can buy the innovation. Some companies do this all the time. Microsoft goes around and just buys innovative companies. They do a lot of innovation on their own, of course, but they bought GitHub, OpenAI, LinkedIn. I mean, you could probably sit there and name a dozen companies, innovative companies that Microsoft bought early on. They didn't completely buy OpenAI, but they have a pretty large stake in it. Open innovation creates space for to work even with other partners outside your firm potentially as well. Corporate incubators, this is a structural idea. Have a skunk works where new ideas have a chance to take off before someone comes and says it's too expensive or it's not a good idea. You need an incubators where you put your little eggs so they can hatch before being exposed to the environment. So sometimes you can create what's called a corporate incubator, like Alphabet was at Google. Different innovation modes. Some of them can use the current business model, some of them require a new business model. Disruptive innovation requires a new business model, as we discussed. Architectural innovation does as well. They've got those as being slightly different. So disruptive innovation can use existing technical capabilities but requires a new business model. Architectural innovation requires both new capabilities and a new business model. Routine mode uses existing capabilities in the current business model, so that's sort of the least innovative in a sense. Radical requires new capabilities but uses the current business model. Feel free to draw on this. I'm not sure if those how widely used these distinctions are out there, but you're welcome to sort of look at this matrix and decide if your firm needs to operate in one of these modes. Which mode are they currently operating within? Is it the right one? Do they need to move from radical to architectural? Do they need to move from routine to radical? Different options. Good. That's all for this lecture. See you in the next one.